after a violent storm, no one at Blue Cypress expected the most shocking thing to be anything other than broken trees, damaged fences, or floodwater tearing through the refuge. Instead, it was the moment a massive female elephant suddenly stopped, turned back, and did everything in her power to save a baby egret that had fallen from its nest. But that was only the beginning. What left everyone speechless was what came after. The bird would not leave her, the elephant would not abandon him, and when nature finally forced them apart, the entire refuge realized they had witnessed a friendship so rare it almost didn't seem possible. Morning settled slowly over Blue Cypress Elephant Refuge, the kind of Florida morning that still carried the last breath of a night storm. Water clung to the oak leaves in silver beads. Wet grass bent under its own shine. Beyond the paddocks, the marsh breathed mist into the fields, and everything looked washed clean, as if the world had begun again before dawn. Daisy moved through that pale light with the calm authority of an animal who had survived more than most. At 29, she was neither young nor old, but there was history in the way she walked. One ear carried a small tear from years no one at the refuge liked to name. Faint scars crossed her side. Even now, after rescue, she still stepped as if someone might ask too much of her. The other elephants followed the routine with sleepy ease, but Daisy always noticed the world first. She noticed wind shifting over standing water. She noticed when Milo, the youngest bull, edged too close to the calves. She noticed Emma Carter lifting feed buckets near the barn, and Ben Walker checking the north gate with the slow care of a man who trusted locks more than luck. Emma liked to say Daisy had the eyes of someone thinking 3 minutes ahead of everyone else. Ben called that nonsense and said a smart elephant was still just an elephant. Neither argued much that morning. The air felt too fresh, too full of birdsong and dripping branches for disagreement. Even the backup generator hummed softly, as if careful not to disturb the peace left behind by the rain. The herd had nearly reached the lower pasture when Daisy stopped. It was not hesitation. It was abrupt, complete stillness, so sudden that the calf behind her bumped lightly into her back leg. Her trunk lifted, her ears opened. The rest of the elephants slowed in confusion, and for a few seconds, the whole field seemed to listen with her for something too small for human ears to catch. Emma noticed first that Daisy was no longer looking toward the feeding line. She was staring at the drainage ditch near the old live oak, where storm water still slid through roots and reeds. Ben followed her gaze, but saw only washed leaves and snapped branches. Then Daisy turned from the herd and began walking toward the ditch with a purpose that made both humans move faster. Beneath the oak, the storm had left behind quiet damage. A nest hung crooked from a lower limb, half torn apart by wind. One broken twig still swayed. At the edge of the ditch, caught between exposed roots and mud, lay a tiny white chick no bigger than Emma's hand. Its feathers were soaked flat. One thin leg kicked weakly. Its cry was nearly swallowed by water. Daisy reached it before either human did. She lowered her trunk with impossible precision, sweeping aside wet leaves without touching the chick. The smell of mud and frightened life rose sharply. Fire ants had begun gathering nearby. The ditch was filling by the minute. One more hard spill from upstream, and the little bird would be dragged beneath the roots and lost before anyone could reach it. Emma called for Ben to bring a towel, then froze when Daisy planted herself between the ditch and the people rushing in. Not aggressively, not wildly, deliberately. Daisy shifted once, angled her body over the chick, and looked at the steel service gate beside the oak. Then she struck it with her trunk. The crack rang across the pasture. She hit it again, harder, and Ben stopped in the mud. For one stunned second, neither human moved. Daisy struck the gate a third time, then swung back and used the tip of her trunk to shove a clump of grass into the trickle of water, slowing the current before it could reach the bird. Emma felt the skin rise on her arms. This was not panic. It was sequence. Call the humans, block the water, hold the ground. Daisy was choosing. Ben came running with a crate and gloves, his face stripped of its old certainty. Above them, a white shape flashed once through the branches, circled hard, and vanished into the wet sky. The mother egret, Emma guessed. But Daisy did not look up. She bent lower, spread her front feet with care, and built a shelter of gray legs and shadow around the chick, while ditch water hissed past. The bird's cries grew softer after that, not because it was stronger, but because it was finally out of the current and hidden from the wind. Rainwater dripped from Daisy's belly. Emma crouched a few feet away, close enough to see the chick trembling, far enough not to break whatever fragile trust had formed in those impossible minutes. Even Milo stood back, restless but strangely quiet. When the sun finally pushed through the storm clouds, a blade of gold slid under the oak and touched the chick's damp back. Daisy did not move. She stood over that tiny life, as if the whole refuge had narrowed to one heartbeat beneath her. Emma lowered her voice. Ben removed his cap, and in the bright branches above them, something small and broken waited to see what this giant would do next. The light under the old oak kept shifting as the morning opened wider, but Daisy did not give any of it her attention. She stood exactly where she had planted herself, broad and steady, her shadow sheltering the soaked little egret chick from the heat rising off the ditch. Every few seconds, the tip of her trunk hovered low, checking the fragile movement beneath her. Emma moved first, slowly, talking in the same soft tone she used with frightened rescues. She held out a towel and a shallow crate, hoping Daisy might recognize help when it was offered gently. But the elephant's eyes stayed fixed on the ground between her feet. When Emma stepped one pace closer, Daisy shifted her weight and blocked the opening without a sound. It was not anger. That made it harder. Daisy did not pin her ears or throw dust or bluff charge the fence. She simply refused to yield. Ben muttered that the bird would die if they kept waiting, but even he did not fully believe his own certainty anymore. He had seen the sequence by the gate. He had seen Daisy think, then act, then guard what she had saved. Above them, white wings flashed between the limbs. The mother egret had come back. She circled once, then twice, calling in sharp, desperate bursts that seemed too thin for such a heavy morning. The chick answered weakly from beneath, Daisy's chest. Emma felt the moment tighten around all of them at once. Mother above, child below, and one massive stranger standing between fear and safety. The ants found the bird before the people found a solution. A dark line began moving through the wet leaves, climbing over roots toward the small patch of dry ground under Daisy's body. Emma saw them and swore under her breath. Before she could react, Daisy lowered her trunk and swept the line aside in a clean, practiced arc, then pressed mud over the path like a wall. Ben stared at that and said nothing for a long time. He had worked storms, births, injuries, fences down in hurricane season, and he had never once seen an elephant defend something so small with that kind of precision. Emma took another careful step, trying to slide the towel forward with a rake handle. Daisy let the towel pass, but not Emma's hand. The message could not have been clearer. By noon, the rest of the herd had drifted toward the far pasture, leaving Daisy alone beneath the oak. Milo had tried twice to come back, restless and curious, but Ben had drawn him off with feed. Daisy did not follow. She ignored cut fruit, ignored soaked hay, ignored the low contact rumbles from the others. For the first time since Emma had known her, food no longer outranked vigilance. The heat thickened after lunch. Steam rose from the ditch bank. The chick stopped crying for a while, and that silence scared Emma more than the noise had. She crouched by the fence, watching for the smallest sign of breathing. Then Daisy bent one knee, slowly, impossibly slowly, lowering her chest just enough to cast deeper shade without closing the space around the bird. It was there, in that breath-held stillness, that Emma understood what Ben still resisted. Daisy was not acting on some random burst of curiosity that would fade in an hour. She was making adjustments. Protecting the bird had become a problem to solve, moment by moment. Shade, air, distance, ants, water. The elephant was answering each danger as it appeared, as if the chick belonged to her care now. Late afternoon brought another brief shower, sudden and hard. Rain hammered the oak leaves and sent silver streams running through the ditch again. The mother egret vanished into the gray. Emma grabbed a slicker and ran for higher ground, but Daisy never moved more than half a step. She turned her body against the wind, angled her shoulder into the rain, and kept the smallest, driest pocket beneath her. When dusk settled over Blue Cypress, the refuge lights flickered on one by one. Ben brought fresh feed to the fence and left it untouched. Emma set up a folding chair near the oak and called the overnight vet, though she already knew what the real complication was. No medicine could do much if Daisy refused separation. No rulebook had a page for a moment like this. Night deepened by inches. Frogs began calling from the marsh, and the generator hummed beyond the barns. Once, sometime after full dark, the chick gave a stronger cry than before. Daisy answered with a low rumble, so soft Emma felt it more than heard it. A vibration moving through wet ground and chair legs. The little bird settled almost at once, as if it had understood comfort in a foreign language. Near midnight, Ben returned with coffee and stood beside Emma without speaking. Under the floodlight glow, Daisy looked almost carved from stone, except for the slow motion of her trunk tracing the air over that tiny life. Finally, Ben exhaled and said the one thing he had fought all day not to believe. Maybe, he murmured, she wasn't keeping them away? Maybe she was keeping the bird alive until morning. Dawn came back to Blue Cypress in soft layers, pale gold over wet pasture, pale blue over the ditch, pale steam rising off the ground Daisy had guarded all night. She was still there when Emma stepped out of the barn with a flashlight and a paper cup gone cold in her hand. The feed Ben had left was barely touched. The elephant had chosen watchfulness over hunger. The chick was alive. That was the first miracle of the morning. Curled in the pocket of trampled grass between Daisy's front feet, the little egret lifted its head and opened its beak at the light. Its cries were thin but steadier than the night before. Emma let out a breath she had been holding for hours, and even Ben, coming up behind her, slowed as if he had entered a church. Daisy checked the bird before she noticed anything else. The tip of her trunk drifted down, not touching, only feeling the warmth of its body, the quickness of its breath, the stubborn pulse of something that had not given up. Then she raised her head toward the branches above. The broken nest still leaned in the crook of the oak, ragged and useless now, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The mother egret returned just after sunrise. She came in low this time, not wild with panic as she had been the day before, but sharp-eyed and cautious. White wings flashed through strips of sun. She landed on a lower limb, called once, and waited. The chick answered at once from the shelter of Daisy's legs, and the sound that passed between them seemed to loosen something in Emma's chest. Ben thought that should have settled it. He said the mother was back, the worst was over, and Daisy needed to rejoin the herd. But when Emma lifted the crate and took one step toward the bird, Daisy shifted in front of it again, with the same quiet certainty as before. No threat, no tantrum, just refusal. It was becoming impossible to miss that she was not guarding possession. She was guarding timing. For most of the morning, Daisy stayed beneath the oak while the little family negotiated around her. The mother bird flew down with tiny scraps of food, then darted back to a branch. The chick swallowed, trembled, and tucked closer to Daisy's shadow. Once it tried to stand and pitched sideways in the grass. Daisy bent so fast Emma's heart jumped, but the trunk that reached down moved with astonishing care. Emma named the bird Finn sometime before noon, half without meaning to. She was kneeling by the fence, writing notes on a feed invoice because she had run out of clean paper, when she looked up and said, "Easy there, Finn." Ben gave her a sideways look, the kind men like him used when they did not want to admit they had already started caring too. By evening, he was using the name too. By the second day, Daisy had built a new rhythm around the bird. She would leave the oak for a little while to drink or eat when Emma and Ben stood nearby, then circle back sooner than usual, as if some invisible line always tugged her home. The herd adjusted around her absence. Milo grumbled and paced. One of the older cows called low from the far pasture. Daisy answered, but she did not leave for long. Finn changed quickly under that strange protection. His feathers dried into soft white instead of storm-plastered gray. His neck grew steadier. His calls sharpened. He began testing his legs with small, stubborn bursts of balance, rising on them for a second or two before dropping back down. Every time he wobbled, Daisy's trunk hovered nearby like a question she prayed she would not have to answer. The hardest moment came on the third afternoon. A gust rolled in off the marsh, carrying the warning smell of another storm cell, and Finn startled at the clap of a distant gate. He flapped too soon, too hard, lifting himself clear of the ground in a desperate little scramble. For one breathless instant, he was airborne. Then he tipped sideways toward the ditch, and Emma heard herself cry out. Daisy moved before the humans did. She swung her trunk beneath him, not quite catching him, but changing the fall just enough. Finn landed against the thick fold of skin above her foreleg instead of dropping into the muddy runoff. He clung there in stunned silence, tiny claws tangled in damp hide, while the mother egret wheeled overhead in alarm. Ben stopped dead beside the fence, his face gone pale beneath his cap. What happened next was small, but it changed everything. Finn did not scramble away when he regained himself. He stayed where he had landed, shivering against Daisy's leg, then climbed awkwardly higher as if following some instinct stronger than fear. Daisy stood perfectly still, every muscle under control. Inch by inch, with clumsy little hops and wild wings, the chick made his way up to the broad slope of her shoulder. By sunset, the storm had drifted north, and the oak leaves were lit copper from the west. Emma and Ben stood without speaking as Finn gathered himself for one last effort, flapped once, then twice, and rose no more than a foot before settling on the very top of Daisy's head. He looked impossibly small there, a white fleck against weathered gray. Daisy did not shake him off. She only lifted her face into the evening light and stood as if she had been waiting for him all along. By the next morning, Blue Cypress had a new sight no one could have imagined a week earlier. Daisy stepped out into the washed green pasture with a white egret chick perched on her head like a scrap of cloud that had chosen not to fly away. Finn swayed with each of her strides, still clumsy, still light, but no longer frightened by the height or the giant beneath him. Daisy moved more slowly than usual at first, testing every rise and turn of the ground, as if she knew someone small was learning the rhythm of her body. Each time Finn lost balance, he spread his half-grown wings and steadied himself against the warm curve of her skull. Emma watched from the fence line, unable to stop smiling. Ben pretended not to notice, but he kept looking anyway. The herd noticed before long. Milo approached with open curiosity, trunk lifted, ears twitching, his restless energy making the calves bunch close to the older cows. Finn gave a quick, uncertain chirp and tucked lower against Daisy's head. Daisy answered by angling one shoulder between Milo and the bird, a quiet warning that needed no sound. The young bull backed off, not offended, only surprised. That was how the new pattern began. Finn no longer waited under the oak for Daisy to return. He rode with her. When she crossed the field, he crossed it too. When she stopped to tear palmetto fronds or pull at damp hay, he watched the refuge from his high little throne, neck turning in quick, bright movements. His world had widened, and somehow Daisy had widened it for him. At first, everyone assumed the bird simply liked the view. Then Emma started noticing the timing. Finn made one short call when Ben rolled the feed cart from the barn, another when the calves wandered too near the low fence, and a different, sharper sound when something unfamiliar moved in the sawgrass beyond the drainage channel. Daisy seemed to sort those sounds without confusion, responding before anyone else understood why. Dr. Hannah Reed arrived that Friday from Tampa, carrying field notebooks, a long lens, and the patient, alert expression of someone who had spent years being careful with rare things. Emma had called her after the third day of watching Finn remain with Daisy. Hannah did not laugh when she heard the story. She only asked what the elephant did when the bird grew quiet, and whether the bird ever chose anyone else. By afternoon, the heat had turned glossy and still. The herd drifted toward the marsh-side pasture, where the ground stayed soft and green longer than the rest. Daisy led them as she always did, with Finn balanced above her like a pale thought. Hannah followed at a distance with her camera. Ben came too, mostly to prove there was nothing supernatural happening, though even he had stopped using that word out loud. The edge of the marsh looked harmless that day. Water sat low and dark between reeds. Dragonflies flashed blue over its skin, and the mud near the bank had dried into cracked plates. Milo broke from the group first, tossing his head, showing off for no one in particular. He was young enough to confuse confidence with safety. Daisy gave a low call for him to slow down, but he ignored her. Finn saw it before the humans did. His body stiffened. Then he let out a rapid, piercing cry, unlike any sound Emma had heard from him before. 3 sharp notes, close together, urgent enough to split the lazy afternoon in half. Daisy reacted instantly. Her head came up, her ears widened, and in the same heartbeat, a dark shape slid beneath the reeds at the water's edge. It was a juvenile alligator, not full grown but large enough to do damage, lying half buried in the black mud where Milo's next step would have taken him. Hannah saw only the tail at first. Ben saw the eyes. But Daisy did not need the full picture. She charged forward with a speed that made the ground jump, cutting across Milo's path and driving him sideways with the force of her shoulder. The gator lunged at the how movement and snapped on empty air. Mud exploded. Milo stumbled back with a startled trumpet, and the calves scattered behind the older cows. Daisy planted herself between the marsh and the herd, head high, trunk curled, broad as a wall. Finn stayed exactly where he was, wings half spread, crying out again and again until the alligator sank backward into the reeds and disappeared. For several seconds after it was over, no one spoke. Hannah lowered her camera because her hands had started to shake. Ben swore once, softly, not from anger, but from the kind of shock that empties a man's voice out. Milo stood behind Daisy, panting, his pride gone from him. Finn, small and fierce above it all, tucked himself low against Daisy's head as if he understood what his warning had just prevented. The sun softened by evening, laying long bronze light over the pasture as the herd settled again. Daisy finally lowered her head to graze, calm returning by degrees, while Finn remained in place like a white ribbon tied there by fate. Hannah wrote for nearly an hour without looking up. When she finally closed her notebook, she said what Emma had already begun to believe. This was no accident anymore. It was trust, learning how to speak. For the next several days, Daisy carried the new rhythm of her life as if it had always belonged to her. She grazed with Finn resting between her ears, drank with him balanced above the dark ripple of her reflection, and crossed the refuge grounds at a pace just slow enough for a young bird to trust. Nothing in her body seemed impatient with his learning. Dr. Hannah Reed began arriving at sunrise, long before the heat settled over Blue Cypress. She would stand by the fence with a notebook in one hand and coffee in the other, watching Daisy as if she were reading a language no one had fully translated. Ben still called it observation. Emma had started calling it witnessing. Hannah, wisely, called it both. The pattern became impossible to ignore once someone bothered writing it down. Finn used one bright clipped call when a feed cart rolled near. Another, softer one, when Daisy drifted too far from shade. A harsher burst came whenever strangers approached the north fence. Daisy answered each sound differently, not with tricks or training, but with the kind of instant understanding built only through attention. She had changed in smaller ways, too. Before Finn, Daisy preferred the open end of the pasture, where she could keep the herd moving and avoid long stops. Now she paused near the old oak each morning, giving the bird time to preen and stretch. When he cleaned behind the folds of her ears, she stood utterly still, her eyes half closed, as if relief had become a form of trust. Even Milo had begun to accept the little white passenger who rode above Daisy's thoughts. The young bull still snorted and tossed his head whenever Finn swooped too low. But he no longer challenged Daisy's quiet rules. The calves loved the bird, openly. They followed his shadow, reached for him with their trunks, and froze in delight whenever he landed just out of reach and flicked back into the air again. By late summer, the afternoons at Blue Cypress had a heavy stillness that made every sound travel farther than it should. One evening, as thunder rolled somewhere west of the marsh, the refuge lost power. The lights in the barn blinked once and died. The backup generator should have started within seconds. It didn't. The whole property dropped into a darkness too sudden to feel natural. Ben grabbed a flashlight and headed for the generator shed, muttering under his breath. Emma moved toward the calf paddock, counting silhouettes by memory more than sight. Daisy felt the change before the humans found its cause. Her head came up, her ears opened. Finn, perched high and pale against the dark, went completely still. In the hush that followed, the refuge seemed to hold its breath. Then Finn screamed. Not the sharp warning he had used at the marsh, not the quick call for a stranger on the road, but something raw and rapid that cut through the dark like a blade. Daisy spun before Emma could see why. At the far end of the service lane, two rangy dogs had slipped through a side gate, left unlatched during storm repairs, their eyes catching silver in the flashlight beam. They were not large enough to threaten Daisy, but size meant nothing to animals built on panic and hunger. The dogs had already scented the calves. One darted low along the fence line, while the other tested the shadows behind the hay barn. Daisy moved with a force that made the loose gravel jump. She swung across the lane, drove the nearest calf behind her, and sent a deep rumble through the ground. The sound rolled through the dark like thunder finding a body. The older cows answered at once, closing ranks around the young. Milo, for all his foolishness, finally understood the assignment and shouldered himself into place beside Daisy. Above them, Finn wheeled in frantic circles, crying each time one of the dogs changed direction, his little white body flashing in and out of the black as if stitched from lightning. Emma reached the fence with a flare stick from the emergency box, just as Ben got the generator alive again. Light burst back across the refuge in hard yellow panels. One dog bolted instantly. The other hesitated too long. Daisy lunged a single step, ears spread wide, and the animal broke, scrambling through the reeds toward the outer road. Just like that, the danger passed, but the air stayed trembling. Afterward, the calves pressed close to their mothers, shaken but unhurt. Finn dropped back to Daisy's head, panting with his beak open, feathers ruffled by fear and effort. Daisy did not resume grazing. She stood where she was, still facing the dark gap in the fence, keeping watch long after Ben chained the gate and Emma confirmed every animal was safe. It was not victory in her posture. It was duty. Ben came, over later with his flashlight lowered and his voice quieter than Emma had ever heard it. He looked at Daisy, then at Finn, then out toward the marsh where the dogs had vanished. He said he had spent 30 years around livestock, rescues, and storm-broken animals, and he had never seen a wild bird hold a line with an elephant. Hannah wrote the sentence down exactly as he said it. That night, with the power steady again and frogs calling from the wet grass, Hannah stayed by the fence long after the others had gone in. Daisy finally relaxed enough to rest one hind foot, while Finn tucked his head beneath one wing and slept above her brow. Hannah closed her notebook and watched them in silence, wondering what would happen if the world ever asked them to choose between love and survival. The change announced itself before the sky fully committed to it. At Blue Cypress, late summer storms usually came fast and left fast, grumbling over the marsh and rolling out by supper. This one lingered offshore for days, growing larger on every weather map. Daisy could not read screens, but she felt the pressure in the air long before the humans spoke its name aloud. By Tuesday, the refuge had lost its easy rhythm. Trucks came and went, chains clinked, radios crackled from dawn until dark. Ben checked latches twice, then a third time, his jaw tight in a way Emma had learned to read as worry. Hannah stood with folded arms near the barn, watching Daisy and Finn as if she already understood what no one had said yet. The hurricane had shifted north overnight, then bent back west, aiming straight for the coast. Blue Cypress was outside the surge line, but not outside danger. If the storm held its course, the lower pastures would flood, the oak line could come down, and the service road might vanish under black water. The evacuation order came just after noon. The other elephants felt the human urgency and answered it with unease. Milo paced the fence and threw dust over his shoulders, though the sky remained strangely clear. The calves stayed close to the older cows. Daisy stood apart for a long time near the old oak, still as weathered stone, while Finn moved restlessly between the branches and the broad crown of her head. Emma tried to keep her voice calm as the loading ramps were lowered and the transport trailers backed into place. She spoke to Daisy the way people do when they know words are too small, but hope tone might still matter. Ben laid out feed near the ramp. Hannah took notes at first, then stopped. There were moments when writing felt too much like standing outside a fire. Finn seemed to understand change in the oldest way possible. He did not settle. He flew short circles above Daisy, then landed, then lifted again before her body had fully stilled beneath him. Every few minutes, he looked toward the marsh, toward the broken line of trees, toward the sky itself. Daisy tracked him with her eyes each time, and something in her face grew heavier. The first two elephants loaded with only the usual resistance, the deep uncertainty of large animals asked to trust a narrow metal path. Milo fought the process, then gave in. The calves followed their mothers trembling but obedient. Soon only Daisy remained in the holding lane, a single gray figure beside the oak, while the wind picked up and rattled the loose tin on the feed shed. Emma led her toward the final trailer with a bucket of cut fruit. Daisy walked beside her until they reached the base of the ramp. Then she stopped so completely, the chain on her leg guide went slack. She did not back away. She did not flare her ears or trumpet. She simply refused the next step, eyes lifting past the trailer roof to the restless white shape in the darkening sky. Ben asked for more time. The storm would not give it. The outer bands were already pulling cloud over the refuge in bruised streaks of gray and green. Hannah looked from Daisy to Finn and said very quietly that this was not stubbornness, it was recognition. Daisy understood separation, perhaps not in human words, but in the deep, irreversible sense that one road could close behind you. Rain began as a fine spray, then thickened. The metal ramp turned slick. Emma stood in it anyway, soaked hair against her cheeks, whispering Daisy's name as if she could build a bridge out of devotion alone. Daisy lifted one foot, lowered it, then turned her head sharply toward the oak. Finn was gone. For a single terrible moment, The whole refuge seemed to hollow out around that absence. Then he came back through the rain. Small, bright, and fighting the wind, Finn broke from the blur of branches and flew low across the lane. He did not head for the trees. He did not veer toward shelter. He landed on the cold steel rail of the trailer ramp, wings spread for balance, and let out the same sharp cry he had used by the marsh, only softer now, almost pleading. Everything in Daisy changed at that sound. The tension in her shoulders loosened, not because the pain was gone, but because the choice had finally become clear enough to bear. She stepped forward once, then again, each foot placed with grave, deliberate care. When she reached the top of the ramp, she paused and stretched her trunk toward Finn, stopping just short of touching him. Finn answered by hopping higher on the rail, rain running down his white feathers in silver lines. Daisy looked at him for one long breath, then entered the trailer without another fight. The door shut behind her with a heavy, final sound. As the engine started and the convoy rolled out into the storm, Finn remained on the rail until the last possible second, then rose into the rain while Daisy stood inside the dark, listening. The inland shelter sat on higher ground, nearly 40 miles from Blue Cypress, surrounded by pine scrub and a silence that felt wrong to every animal unloaded there. Daisy stepped down from the trailer under a sky the color of wet cement and stood for a long moment without moving. No marsh wind touched her skin. No live oak shaded the road. No white wings crossed overhead. The handlers called it a safe site, and they were right in every practical sense. The fencing was strong, the water troughs were full, and the elevated barns had survived storms before. But safety had a thin sound to it when the heart was elsewhere. Daisy drank because Emma asked her to. She followed the others because the lane narrowed. Yet something essential in her had remained behind. Through the first night of rain, she kept turning her head toward the eastern dark, toward the direction of the coast and the drowned flatlands beyond it. The older cows settled by degrees, leaning into one another when the wind struck the shelter walls. Milo threw his unease around like a challenge and then wore himself out. Daisy alone stayed standing, listening to a distance too far to hear. By the second morning, Emma noticed what Ben had hoped not to notice. Daisy ate, but only when urged. She walked, but without her old steadiness at the front of the herd. She paused at every fence corner and lifted her trunk into air that carried only pine resin, mud, and diesel. Each time a white gull or cattle bird crossed the road beyond the pines, her head rose fast, then lowered slower. Hannah wrote very little those first days. Some changes did not need science to be visible. Daisy no longer rumbled low to settle the calves at dusk. She no longer corrected Milo with her usual patient certainty. She moved like an animal doing what survival required while waiting for a sound that did not come. Even Ben, stubborn as weathered wood, stopped trying to call that anything less than grief. Back at Blue Cypress, the storm had done exactly what the forecasts feared, and something worse besides. Water had climbed into the lower pasture and torn channels through the service road. Tin roofing lay twisted in the reeds. Half the south fence was down. When Ben returned with a cleanup crew 3 days later, he found the old live oak split nearly to its heart, one great limb broken and hanging low. Emma did not ask her first question out loud, but Ben answered it anyway when he called from the refuge. No nest remained, no clean perch, no trace of white feathers in the mud below the tree. He said it gently, though there was no gentle way to say it. Daisy listened to Emma's side of the conversation from across the holding yard and went still before the call was over. For more than a week, the rhythm of the inland refuge settled around loss. The calves resumed their games. Milo rediscovered his appetite. The daily chores found their old order again. Daisy never caused trouble, never turned dangerous, never refused care. That almost made it harder. She carried her sorrow with such discipline that Emma began to dread the quiet more than any outburst she might have understood. And yet, the story had not ended where the humans feared it had. At Blue Cypress, between fallen branches and soaked grass, Finn had survived the storm by doing what Daisy had once taught him without either of them knowing it. He kept low when the wind screamed. He chose shelter over panic. He learned the angles of broken wood, the safe pockets out of the rain, the stubborn work of waking up alive. He was thinner now, and the softness of youth had left him all at once. He searched flooded ditches for insects, skimmed standing water, and took short, sharp flights through the changed refuge as if measuring what the storm had spared. Other egrets passed through in loose white groups, but Finn did not follow them far. Evening after evening, he returned to the wreck of the split oak and waited there. Ben saw him first at dusk on the 18th day. He had stayed late repairing a side gate and noticed a white streak cut through the copper light, circle once above the broken tree, then settle on the jagged limb that remained. He stood in the mud with his tools in his hands, watching the bird face east, not feeding, not preening, only holding the line between memory and hope. The next evening, Finn came back again, and the next. Sometimes he circled twice before landing. Sometimes he called once into the empty pasture, a small sound against all that ruin. Ben began timing his work, so he would be there to see it. When he told Emma, her eyes filled before she spoke. When Hannah heard, she closed her notebook and said some loyalties outlive disaster without needing permission. 3 weeks after the evacuation, the first clear sunrise opened over the inland shelter in a sky scrubbed clean by departing weather. Daisy stood near the fence while the others fed, her ears quiet, her gaze far away. Then a white bird crossed high above the road beyond the pines, only passing through, nothing more. Still, for the first time in days, Daisy lifted her head and answered the morning with a sound. It was low, brief, and full of waiting. By the 4th week after the evacuation, the roads back to Blue Cypress had finally dried enough for the transport trucks to pass. The refuge was not whole again, but it was standing. Fence lines had been patched. Debris had been burned or hauled away. The marsh still wore the storm like a bruise, yet the place had begun, in its stubborn Florida way, to breathe again. Daisy sensed the return before the trailer doors even opened. She stood through the loading without protest this time, calm in a way that worried Emma more than resistance would have. Grief had made her quieter, not easier. As the convoy rolled east, pine scrub gave way to flat wetlands, then to the familiar shimmer of sawgrass and live oak. Daisy lifted her head long before anyone spoke. When Blue Cypress came into view, the herd stirred with low, relieved rumbles. Milo pressed forward against the divider. The calves shifted with the restless energy of children, recognizing home after too many strange nights. But Daisy did not answer their excitement. She stood still inside the moving trailer, her ears open, her eyes fixed on the broken line of trees beyond the service road, searching for one small flash of white. The unloading should have been routine. Ben had feed waiting. Emma stood at the base of the ramp with her usual soft voice ready. Hannah lingered a little farther back, notebook closed for once. One by one, the others stepped down into the bright morning. Daisy was the last. She paused at the top of the ramp, drew in the scent of wet grass and mud and old bark, then walked past the feed without looking at it. She did not head for water. She did not turn toward the shaded pasture where the rest of the herd was already gathering. Instead, she crossed the refuge with grave, deliberate purpose, moving straight toward the old live oak that had once held a torn nest and a life small enough to fit beneath her chest. Emma followed at a distance. Ben removed his hat without seeming to know he had done it. The tree looked worse up close. One great limb had snapped away completely. The trunk was split and scarred down one side, pale wood exposed beneath the bark. Storm grass had grown up around the roots, and the ditch below was narrower now, choked with fresh silt and reeds. Daisy stopped beneath the damaged branches and stood very still, as if the ground itself might answer her if she waited long enough. For several breaths, nothing happened. A dragonfly skimmed the ditch. Wind moved softly through the sawgrass. Somewhere beyond the south fence, a work crew dropped a board and laughed about something ordinary. The plainness of those sounds made the silence under the oak feel even deeper. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth. Ben looked away toward the barn. Even Hannah seemed unwilling to break the moment by naming it. Then Daisy lifted her trunk, not high in alarm, but gently, toward the split heart of the tree. She gave a low rumble that rolled through the roots and into the soft earth. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It sounded instead like something old and faithful, calling into a place where it had once been answered. The note faded into the morning, and for one aching second, the world remained empty. A white shape dropped out of the light so fast, Emma thought at first it was a leaf torn loose by wind. But leaves did not bank in a clean arc. Leaves did not cry out with joy. Finn came down from the upper branches in a bright streak, circled Daisy once, twice, then landed exactly where he always had, on the broad crown of her head, light as memory and impossibly real. Everything in Daisy changed. The heaviness she had carried for weeks seemed to leave her body all at once. Her head rose, her ears opened wide. She gave a rumble so deep the calves answered from across the pasture, and Finn, no longer a helpless chick, but not yet fully grown, balanced there with wings half spread, as though no storm had ever stood between them. Emma was crying before she realized it. Ben let out a broken laugh and wiped at his eyes with the back of one weathered hand. Hannah did not write a single word. She only watched Daisy turn slowly beneath the oak, careful as ever, while Finn stepped forward to peck softly behind one ear in the old, familiar place. Home was not the fence line, not the barn, not even the pasture. For Daisy, in that moment, home had feathers. Then the morning gave them one more surprise. Another white egret glided down to a lower branch, larger than Finn, graceful and unafraid. She carried a thin strand of marsh grass in her beak. Finn lifted off Daisy's head, met her in midair, and the two birds flew together to the broken fork of the oak where storm-torn branches had formed a shallow cradle just above Daisy's reach. There, before the humans and the herd and the elephant who had once saved one fallen chick, the pair began setting grass into the crook of the damaged tree. Not a perfect nest, Not yet. Just the first patient pieces of one. Daisy stood beneath them without moving, her great body making a circle of safety below. She could not rebuild the branch that had broken, but she could guard what would rise there next. By evening, the refuge had settled into a softer light, gold on wet leaves, gold on the split trunk, gold on Daisy's scarred back. Finn returned to her head once before dusk, then flew up again to the new nest, taking shape above her. Daisy remained under the oak until the stars came out. She no longer looked like an animal waiting for what was lost. She looked like a guardian keeping watch over what had returned. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments for Daisy and a 0 for Finn. And if you believe real kindness can still exist in this world, let me know with a simple yes below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because there are many more unforgettable animal stories waiting for you right here on this channel. Stay with us for the next story. You may think you've seen everything, but the next one might touch you even more deeply.